Hello, I'm Peter Robinson. Just days ago, we lost Charles Hill, who died at the age of 84. Charlie had two careers. First, he was a very distinguished diplomat who worked closely with both Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Secretary of State George Shultz. And then in the 90s, after leaving the State Department, he began an academic career. He was diplomat in residence at Yale and a visiting fellow here at the Hoover Institution, where Charlie and I'm delighted to be able to say, became friends. Here, a few minutes of Charlie Hill on a couple of shows that we recorded over the years. You'll hear Charlie talk about the emergence of the state system. You'll hear him talk about the American people and their willingness to play the role that history has given the United States. You'll hear him talk about the importance of grasping history, not just issues as they're taught in our institutions these days, but the sweep of history, as he put it, what got us here. You'll also see Fuad Ajami, the late scholar of the Middle East, and Jim Mattis, former Secretary of Defense. But this is a few minutes of Charlie Hill, just a few minutes of one of the wisest men I've ever known.
This really isn't a matter of the West versus the Middle East, Arab, Islamic world, because what we're talking about here doesn't go back to ancient Athens. It really starts in the early modern period, starts at the end of the 30 Years' War. And
Treaty
that's,
of Westphalia.
That's the Westphalian system, the state system.
Right.
And that is a procedural system. In other words, it's very, very simple. You've got to be a state. You've got to adhere or try to adhere to international law, international organizations. You're going to have to follow certain norms like no slavery. You have to have a professional military and diplomatic corps. And that's it. In other words, you follow the procedures, and then if you do that, you can be a legitimate, recognized member of the state, international state system.
So my searching around for democratic tradition is beside the point.
So it's not, and this becomes, as the centuries go by in the modern era, this becomes adopted internationally. So it's no longer the West. In fact, the United States didn't like this system in the 19th century. We were very wary of it and didn't want to get fully involved with it. But eventually, as the 20th century went along, you found that this was the system being adopted all around the globe because it was procedural, because people could see that if I follow the rules, I can be Buddhist, I can be whatever I want to be. I can be socialist, or I can be democratic, but I don't have to follow some substantive line of thought. So when this is being done after World War I, it's not really the West imposing itself. It's saying to the Middle East, you really have got to get yourself into this system because it's the world system. Or are you going to put yourself at odds with it and adversarial to it? Obama administration, as brought forward in a book review in the New York Times of yesterday, is redefining America's role in the world, America's power in the world, and the phrase there used was to be modest and downbeat. And if that's the case, if we are pulling out, and that's the way it's seen by the regimes and by the rest of the world as though the Americans are now in a very different mode. We are not going to be directly supporting those who are seeking freedom. We are not going to be taking a leadership role. And we're not going to be fighting for the international system. We're going to be more acquiescent to changes in regimes and around the world. And if that's the case, then the regimes that run or will run the Middle East could take it entirely out of the international order as we have known it. And they've got examples such as the so-called China model, which is a different way of looking at the world than we have thought about it since the end of World War II. And that is, you have an open economic system in order to become rich and powerful, but you have a closed political system, and you don't really subscribe to the international state system of the last 300 or 400 years. If that's the case, then we're headed for a very, very different world. It's going to be something that's not going to be very attractive to us.
Fundamentally, what was happening was that the people who ran the country said, we're tired of this. We're tired of this.
That's not reading the American public, that's feeding it.
Yeah.
That's not leadership. if you go to the middle of the country and talk about these things, you don't hear people saying how tired they are, how we've got to pull back or we can't do it anymore. It's not. It's a failure of understanding what really is at stake. And that is that the kind of world that we're going to be moving into is one that's not going to be moving toward freedom, not going to be moving toward open trade, not going to be a procedurally based international system. And you can hear the voices, quite intellectual, well thought out there now describing what they think the next world order ought to be. And it's not at all like this one.
The American military commitment, that is to say the burden on ordinary taxpayers, never, ever ends. And now you two are saying, okay, add to the list Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. You're asking too much. You're just asking too much. Charlie?
It can't be too much because we're talking about something that is utterly fundamental, that goes to the very foundations of the way we live, the way we think, the way civilization has progressed over years and centuries. It's got to come first with defense and with world order. It has to. Nothing else is going to work without that. And only we can do it. And that is looking more and more to be the case. European allies, we have subsidized the European social welfare state so that they do not have to have a defense capability, and they have now shown that they don't have one. So it's up to us. We have a Navy. No Navy can match ours in any sense anywhere in the world. It's a several ocean Navy. And yet we're talking about sequestration of the defense budget. It can't, if this goes, the whole thing goes.
If we're not there, if we don't involve ourselves in the world, chaos will follow. We have to take this role because the world is too scary if we don't. Can you persuade people that there's something ennobling about the effort?
This is a fallen world. This world is really trouble. And there's no doubt about that. So without security, without stability, then nothing else can really be done successfully. And it is the Washington politicians who have been telling the American people that they are tired. The American people, I don't believe, are tired. And I think the politicians are doing this because they have their own agenda. So leadership...
Washington's worn out, not the country.
Right. Secondly, whether it's 600 bases or whether it's 400 or 200 bases, those positions that we hold are our best guardian against war. We have changed our education in the last 30 or 40 years so that students are really not being taught history. They're not being taught what it was that got us here. History gave way to being taught issues, and issues are something abstract. They're just out there. They somehow just show up. And that is the fundamental reason why we have this seeming obliviousness or ignorance about the way the world has got to be managed in order to make everything else work well. If we don't know that, then it's all going to fall apart.
Charles Hill, diplomat, scholar, the wisest of men, the best of friends. 1936 to 2021.